What could cause a flight crew to handle an emergency in almost the complete opposite way to how they have been trained? As this aircraft tumbled through the dark snowy night, it changed the American aviation industry to its core, but did it do so for the right reasons? Stay tuned. The story of Colgan Air Flight 3407 took its place on the 12th of February 2009. It was a very windy and cold winter day in Newark Airport, and because of the windy weather, the airport was suffering from severe ground delays. The pilots and crew in this story was originally supposed to operate 2 more flights before doing Flight 3407 to Buffalo, Niagara Falls Airport. But those flights had been cancelled due to the weather and the long ground delays. This meant that the crew now only had to operate 2 flights instead of 4, and they were told by the company to report to the airport at a much later time, around 18:10 in the evening. The pilots who were scheduled to operate the flight were both based in Newark, New Jersey Airport, but none of them actually lived in the area. They were operating on something called a commuter contract, and that meant that they actually lived and spent their off time in completely different cities in the United States, but they were expected to fly into their base and start operating from there at the beginning of the roster period. It was up to the pilots to ensure that they had gotten enough proper rest before they turned up for duty, and since they were formerly based in Newark, no hotel accommodation was provided by the company there. They would be provided with hotels during their stay at overnight positions throughout their duty, which was typically the majority of the nights. And this meant that most pilots who were working on this type of agreement with Colgan Air were either staying in hotels or sharing something called a crash pad. That was a small overnight apartment with other pilots in order to reduce their costs. The crew room that the airline provided in Newark was equipped with nice recliner chairs, but Colgan Air expressively prohibited pilots from utilizing the crew room for overnight stays. But even though that was the case, the record shows that the captain in this story, who had already been operating flights on the previous day before the accident happened, likely did spend the night in the crew room based on observations made by other crew members. If he did that, because of the nature of how crew rooms work, with crews arriving and departing constantly as well as performing their briefing duties, it is unlikely that the captain got much quality rest out the night before the accident. The first officer was scheduled to begin her first day of duty on the 12th of February, so she had been traveling from her home in Seattle over to Newark via a stop in Memphis. Her flight from Seattle had departed at 19:51 Pacific Standard Time in the evening on the 11th of February and arrived in Memphis at 02:30 Eastern Standard Time. She had then had to wait for a second cargo aircraft that departed towards Newark at 04:18 and arrived 2 hours later. She reportedly slept for most of these 2 flights, and when a crew member asked her what she was going to do until her report time, she answered that one of the couches in the Newark crew room had her name on it. This meant that none of the 2 pilots who were scheduled to operate Flight 3407 received much quality rest before the flight. And on top of this, the first officer also started showing some symptoms of a light head cold during the day before the flight, but she didn't feel that it was bad enough to consider calling in sick. The aircraft that the crew was going to operate was a Bombardier -8 Q400 turboprop aircraft. It was a modern, high-winged aircraft designed to carry a maximum of 74 passengers and 4 crew members. On the accident day, the aircraft was reported to be in full working order with no technical defects. It was arriving in Newark operated by a different crew at 18:54, only 16 minutes before the scheduled departure time of Flight 3407. This meant that already from the start, the flight was going to be delayed. During the briefing, the pilots discussed the strong winds and the delays expected for departure, and they also briefed their cabin crew about these facts. The flight time was scheduled to be around 53 minutes over to Buffalo, and the weather in Buffalo showed winds from 240 degrees at 15 knots, with 1.5 mile visibility in light snow showers, overcast clouds at around 1,500 feet and a temperature around 1 degree Celsius. There were also some pilot reports of in-flight icing between 3,000 feet and 14,000 feet, but the significant weather report they should have had, which also showed icing, was not included in the briefing pack. The pilots discussed the weather and they decided that the captain was going to be pilot flying for the flight over, and the first officer was going to be pilot monitoring. Now, before we go any further here, it's also worth talking a little bit about the background and the experience of these 2 pilots. The captain was 47 years old and had a total flying experience of 3,379 hours, of which 1,030 hours was as a captain. But he had only flown 111 hours on the Q400. He had previously been flying on another turboprop aircraft, the Saab 340, for the majority of his experience. Now, his training history was a bit spotty, to say the least. He had failed 4 different FAA check rides during his training, including his first instrument check ride, his commercial single-engine, his commercial multi-engine, and also his first attempt on the airline transport pilot license. And during that last failure, he was already flying the Saab 340 for Colgan Air. In all of these check rides, he had been approved on the second attempt. But on top of this, he had also received several trained to proficiency and unsatisfactory grades on his recurrent training inside of Colgan Air, including his initial captain upgrade check on the Saab 340. During his job application to Colgan Air, he had only advised the company of one of these initial training failures, and that's significant because Colgan Air only allowed one failure for the application to go forward. If he would have told them about the other failures, his application would have been rejected. But there was no formal system in force for the airline to be able to check this information at the time of the accident. All of these failures, spread out over his initial training and his continued career, does paint a picture of a pilot who was likely somewhat lacking in capacity. But there was no indication that this capacity deficit had anything to do with his amount of total flying time. That's worth remembering. During the transition from the Saab to the Q400, the captain had received overall good remarks, except for one note from one instructor during his simulator training, which said that he had shown a tendency to overcorrect the aircraft in roll when practicing unusual attitudes. First officers who had flown with the captain stated that he handled the aircraft and procedures well and they liked flying with him. Now, the first officer was 24 years old at the time of the accident. She had flown a total of 2,244 hours, of which 774 was on the Q400. And prior to starting her work with Colgan Air in 2008, she had been working as a flight instructor. She had no failures in her practical FAA flight test, except for a theoretical disapproval for her first instructor rating, but that had to do with her instructor techniques and not her flying skills. Her colleagues described her as a very knowledgeable and diligent pilot, sometimes even above the average of other first officers with similar experience. Anyway, the two pilots got on really well with each other and likely had plenty of time to get to know each other better as they were waiting to start flying given the cancellation of the first 2 flights. When the aircraft finally arrived, the crew walked out to the aircraft and the captain started to set up the cockpit for the flight while the first officer completed the walk around. The 2 cabin crew members started boarding all the 45 passengers who were scheduled for the flight, and then they closed the doors and reported that they were ready to go. At time 19:30, the pilots received their departure clearance from air traffic control, and 15 minutes later they requested pushback and engine start. But because of the amount of traffic ahead of them, they didn't receive clearance to actually start moving until 45 minutes later at time 20:30. Once they had finally been allowed to push, the crew now found themselves as number 20 in the queue for departure. This meant that they were facing a very long further ground delay, and the pilots spent that time discussing personal things as they were slowly taxiing out. It should be mentioned here that the taxi phase is considered a sterile phase of flight, and during that time only operational and safety related things should be discussed in the cockpit. The sterile phase of flight starts when the aircraft initiates the pushback from the gate and then continues until 10,000 feet in the climb. It then starts again at 10,000 feet in the descent until the aircraft is safely parked at the gate. For other airlines, different limits might apply, but the point here is that history has shown that personal discussions during these phases of flight can cause distractions which can be dangerous. That's because of the multitude of mode changes, configurations, ATC communications and other complexities that happens during those times. Having said that, given the fact that this aircraft was stuck in the queue for almost 1 hour on the ground, I do understand that they had some light chit-chat, but reading through the CVR transcript, there was a lot of conversation going on, more than I have seen in any other transcript, and unfortunately, it likely set the tune for the remainder of the flight. During the taxi out, the first officer also used her phone to send a text message to her husband, and as I have explained in previous videos, the use of personal electronic devices is strictly prohibited for similar reasons as I just explained about the sterile phase of flight. But something that is not prohibited is to press the subscribe button and to activate the bell so you don't miss any of my future videos. Anyway, during the taxi out, the first officer mentioned that she felt ready for the hotel room, and the captain responded that he felt sorry for her. She was sneezing and clearing her throat several times, showing the onset of that head cold that I mentioned before. Eventually, the aircraft got to the front of the queue and air traffic control cleared the aircraft for takeoff. The captain announced that he would take control, and at time 21:18 he increased the thrust and started accelerating down runway 22. Now, before I tell you the rest of this story, I just want to give you this short message from my sponsor who makes it possible for me and my team to create these videos. Because you know that I'm a huge fan of good non-fictional stories, before we go any further, I just want to thank today's sponsor, CuriosityStream, a subscription streaming platform with thousands of documentaries costing less than $20 per year. If you like the content on this channel, you're probably going to love the shows over on CuriosityStream because they cover loads of topics like nature, history, music, sports, science, technology, and yes, you guessed it, aviation. Right now I'm watching an original series called Oddly Satisfying Science, hosted by Nick Uhas, and like the name suggests, each episode introduces satisfying experiments designed to blow your mind. Like explaining how forensic teams extract DNA or how hot air balloons actually work. One of the things that I love most about CuriosityStream is that they add new shows every week, and it's available worldwide for almost every possible device, so you'll never run out of new things to watch. So go to curiositystream.com/mentorpilot or click on the link here below and start enjoying unlimited access to the world's top documentaries and non-fiction series. And since you are coming from my channel, they're offering you an amazing deal that will save you 25% off, meaning a price of only $14.99 per year. That's $1.25 per month. Now, let's continue the story. The climb was largely uneventful, and the crew initially adhered to the sterile cockpit rules until the aircraft leveled off at a cruise altitude of 16,000 feet for their short flights over towards Buffalo. During the climb, the aircraft entered into clouds, and given the temperature outside, that also meant icing conditions. When that happened, the pilots followed the company procedures and switched on the aircraft anti-icing system, and as they did so, they also likely switched over the ref speed switch to increase in the overhead panel. The operation of this switch will play a crucial role in what's about to happen later, and to understand it, we need to go into a little bit of aerodynamics now. In order for lift to be generated, the air needs to flow smoothly over all lift-generating surfaces of the aircraft. If there is anything disturbing that flow, the lift created can be disturbed and lead to control difficulties, extra drag, and in the worst case scenario, the aircraft could stall. A stall is what happens when the wing's ability to generate lift drastically reduces, and it can happen due to low speed, contamination, high G loading, or a combination of these. But what always has to happen for a stall to occur is that the critical angle of attack is exceeded. So what is the angle of attack? Well, if you look at the wing from the side, the center of the wing profile is what we refer to as the wing's chord line. In order for the wing to generate more lift, it needs to increase its angle of attack against the oncoming air. And the angle of attack is the angular difference between the oncoming air and that chord line. If you have ever put your hand outside of your car window and changed the angle of your hand, you will have felt the effect that this changing of angle of attack has. If there is ice present on the aircraft wing, it might make the wing less effective, and therefore the wing could stall at a lower angle of attack than it would if the wing was clean. So what does all of this has to do with that switch that I mentioned? Well, the ref speed switch was there to let the aircraft know that it is flying in icing conditions, and when that switch is set to increase, the stall warning system, the stick shaker, would activate at a lower angle of attack to give the pilots an earlier warning of a potential stall. It's worth pointing out here that it doesn't actually mean that the wing is stalling. It just resets the setting of the warning system, and this fact will become very important very soon. Once the aircraft was established in cruise, the crew continued an almost non-stop conversation about home conditions and company policies. Because the cruise phase is not formally a sterile phase of flight, this was perfectly okay in theory, but it's always important to prioritize work, even in the cruise, to make sure that we don't end up in a situation where important tasks get pushed forward and increases the workload later on in the flight. During the cruise, the conversation was only interrupted by occasional yawnings by the crew, potentially showing some level of fatigue already, but the pilots still seemed alert. The captain, for example, was pointing out crossing traffic, and the first officer, who was reviewing the tech log, noticed a small omission made by a previous crew. Before the aircraft reached its programmed top of descent, the first officer listened in to the automatic weather transmission from Buffalo, and it confirmed the forecasted weather that they had received earlier. The visibility was okay, with some snow in the area and light to gusty winds from the west. The captain said that they could probably expect an ILS approach into runway 23 and that they would use flaps 15 for landing. But he didn't start his approach briefing at this point. Instead, the first officer filled in the required performance data into their data link system and sent that over to a company called AeroData, which would calculate the performance for them. When she did this, she omitted the part of the message designed to inform AeroData about the aircraft flying in icing conditions. Now, AeroData sent the reference speeds and the performance back to the crew, and the speeds that they ended up setting was an approach reference speed of 118 knots and a go-around reference speed of 114 knots. Now, if she would have told AeroData of the icing conditions, the reference approach speed would have been automatically increased with 20 knots in order to account for the higher stick shaker onset speed that we discussed before. But sadly, that wasn't done. At time 21:56, the first officer told the captain that it might be easier on my ears if they started to descend a little bit earlier and descended a bit slower. The captain agreed to this, and after having advised air traffic control, the crew started descending down to initially 11,000 feet. 7 minutes later, the crew was handed over to the Buffalo approach controller, who gave them the local pressure setting and told them to prepare for an ILS approach into runway 23. At this point, as the aircraft was now descending, the captain started his approach briefing. During the brief, the aircraft was cleared to descend to 6,000 feet, and at time 22:06, the aircraft descended past 10,000 feet, meaning that they were now in a sterile phase of flight again. The captain continued his briefing, where he also reconfirmed the approach reference speeds, again without any discussion about icing or the position of the reference speed switch. Now, there is a possibility that since the crew had activated the ref speed increase much earlier in the flight, they might have just forgotten about it. The crew were now cleared to descend to 4,000 feet, and the captain asked the first officer how her ears were feeling. She responded that they were feeling stuffy and popping. Around time 22:10, the first officer asked the captain if he could see some ice on his side of the windshield, and he said that yeah, he could. The first officer then commented that she had a lot of ice on her side, and then they both started the conversation about previous experiences they had encountered with icing. This conversation had nothing to do with the flight that they were actually operating. It was more a case of swapping stories. In reality, later tests done during the investigation showed that the amount of ice that the aircraft had accumulated at this point had little to no effect on its aerodynamics and performance. The aircraft performed almost like a clean aircraft would do, so icing in itself was likely not an issue. At time 22:12 and 18 seconds, the approach controller cleared the aircraft to descend to 2,300 feet, which was the initial approach altitude for the ILS, and also to turn onto a heading of 330 degrees. The first officer read that back, the captain set it, and then they continued their lively discussion about icing. The aircraft was now getting closer to the ILS, and they were still maintaining a speed of about 180 knots. On top of that, the descent and approach checklist was still to come, something that they should have done much earlier. The captain now realized this and asked for the checklist to be completed. In the Colgan checklist at the time, there was no triggers regarding the use of different approach speeds due to icing. This, and the fact that the workload now started to increase, meant that none of the pilots spotted the discrepancy between the approach speed that they had selected and the position of the ref speed switch. The aircraft now leveled off at 2,300 feet, and the Buffalo approach controller asked the crew to turn further left onto a heading of 310 degrees. The captain now asked for flaps 5 to be selected, and as he was doing that, the controller told them to turn further left, heading 260 degrees and clear them for the ILS approach for runway 23. The first officer read back the clearance, and since they were now less than 3 miles away from the outer marker of the ILS, that's a point on the approach which is quite close to the runway, they needed to decelerate quickly in order to establish the stabilized approach speed. Decelerating is generally not a huge problem for a turboprop aircraft like the Q400. By changing the pitch of the propeller, you can increase the drag substantially, and that's exactly what the captain now did. He reduced the power levers back to almost idle, and as he was doing this, the approach controller instructed them to contact Buffalo Tower. The first officer read this instruction back, and that was going to be the last contact air traffic control had with Colgan Air Flight 3407. The captain now asked for the landing gear to be extended, and he moved the propeller condition levers into max RPM. Since the speed was now reducing, the autopilot applied a bit of back trim to keep the altitude. This meant that the angle of attack of the aircraft now started increasing. At time 22:16 and 21 seconds, the first officer confirmed that the gear was down, the airspeed was now around 145 knots, reducing, and the aircraft was maintaining 2,300 feet, waiting to capture the glide slope. If the pilots would have monitored their primary flight displays closely at this point, they would have seen how the barber's poles, the low speed indication that shows the onset of a stall warning, was creeping higher and higher up their speed indicator. But none of the pilots seemed to have noticed that. The captain now asked for flap 15 to be selected, and at the same time an ice detected message appeared on the engine display, but it's not clear if anyone actually noticed that. This could have served as the last reminder of the reference speed selector switch and its position. The first officer moved the flap selector to the flaps 10 position, where there was a small detent she needed to move the selector through in order to select flap 15, but she never made it to flap 15. Because at time 22:16 and 27 seconds, the speed had reduced to 135 knots and the angle of attack reached the pre-programmed ice threshold. The stick shaker now suddenly activated, and that likely caused an immediate startle to the crew. It is important to point out here that the aircraft was not in or even close to a stall at this point. The subsequent investigation showed that the ice accumulated on the aircraft at this point did not affect its performance. So the only reason that the stick shaker activated here was because the crew had set the ref speed selector to increase at the same time as they were trying to decelerate to an approach reference speed which was not set for icing. When the stick shaker sounded, the autopilot automatically disconnected as it was supposed to do. The captain reacted to this by pulling back on his controls and also add some, but not max, thrust. This sudden pull on the control generated an immediate increase of G loading on the wings, and when you do that, you further increase the angle of attack on the wing, bringing it closer to an actual stall. This is the reason the first thing that any pilot should do when recognizing an onset of a stall is to pitch forward to reduce the angle of attack and unload the wings. After that, you can think of reducing bank angle or adding thrusts as appropriate, but unloading the wing must be the first thing to do. This is among the very first thing that you learn in flight training, and it is drilled into every pilot throughout their career. So why did the captain now pull back on the controls, the complete opposite to what he had been taught? Well, we will never know this for sure, but it likely had to do with the training that the airline pilots were receiving at the time. Because during training and checking in the simulator, reducing altitude loss during an approach to stall and recovery maneuver was heavily prioritized. If a pilot lost more than 100 feet during the maneuver, it could be recorded as a fail on the check ride. Now, we've seen another example of how that could influence the crew. That was in the Pinnacle Airlines accident, which I also covered in this channel. I'll link to that towards the end of the video. But the Q400 was also a very capable aircraft and had shown that it could pull itself out of an approaching stall by just adding power and keeping the nose more or less leveled. So there is a possibility that this is what went through the mind of the captain as this sudden stick shaker warning came out of nowhere. What actually happened was that his abrupt pull-up maneuver now actually caused the stall that the warning was designed to avoid. This stall induced a rapid roll, initially 45 degrees to the left and then back over towards the right. And as that happened, another feature of the aircraft's anti-stall protection system kicked in, the stick pusher. A stick pusher does what the name suggests. It pushes the stick forward in order to rapidly reduce the angle of attack if the pilots are not doing so. The stick pusher activates when an actual stall is sensed, which was the case now, but instead of allowing the nose to be lowered, the captain fought against it by applying even more back pressure. Again, the complete opposite of what needed to be done. As this was happening, the first officer, who likely had her hand on the flap selector, decided to select the flaps up. She did this without any command from the captain and when the speed had dropped to around 100 knots. Reducing the flaps formed part of the recovery procedure, but only when the speed had increased enough to allow it and only after the direction of the pilot flying. Retracting the flaps at this speed and attitude aggravated the situation severely, since the flaps are there to increase the lift at low speed. Again, it's hard to know why she did this without any instruction. She was likely just as startled by the sudden stick shaker and upset situation as the captain was, and she might just have been trying to help out, or she might have regressed back into her old single-engine instructor habits. The sum of the situation though was that the crew, through lack of situational awareness and crew coordination, was now creating a severe upset situation from nothing. The aircraft was flying perfectly well before this, and the only thing that had happened was an, in reality, spurious stick shaker warning. The aircraft now rolled over as much as 105 degrees to the right before starting to roll back again towards the left. The nose of the aircraft started dropping, still with the captain pulling back on the controls as the stick pusher now activated a second time. On the cockpit voice recorder, the captain can be heard grunting from the strain of pulling against the stick pusher. The roll reached 35 degrees to the left and then rolled back over towards the right again. The first officer asked if the captain wanted the gear to be retracted, and the captain called out, "Gear up, damn it!" The aircraft had now rolled over to 100 degrees right bank and 25 degrees pitch down as the stick pusher activated a third and final time. The combination of all of this meant the start of a very rapid descent from which the crew could not recover. The last thing heard on the cockpit voice recorder was the captain stating, "We're down," and then a loud thumping sound as the aircraft impacted a single family house at time 22, 16 and 54 seconds. All 49 passengers and crew, as well as one person inside of the house, perished in the crash. The ultimate cause of the accident was found to be the lack of adherence to sterile cockpit procedures by the pilots, leading up to them missing important cues of the impending low-speed warning. The captain's completely inappropriate response to the stick shaker, which actually caused the aerodynamic stall, and the first officer's decision to retract the flaps during the upset all led to the accident. The investigation team also looked at the training history of the captain and his many failed skill tests and decided that it must be easier for airlines to access this type of information before hiring a pilot. They also concluded that the simulator training that pilots received regarding approach to stall and recovery had to be improved, as well as proper demonstrations of the stick pusher, which was found to be generally poorly understood. Also, it, together with some other accidents, led to the development of a much more focused upset prevention and recovery simulator training module, which has since become mandatory for all airline pilots. Other important changes coming out of this accident was more scrutiny of how airlines allowed pilots to use commuting contracts and the impact that that could have on their fatigue levels. But one thing that was not mentioned in the findings or in the recommendations from this accident was the establishment of a minimum amount of flight hours needed to start working as a commercial pilot. On the contrary, the recommendations pointed more to the importance of good training, proper aircraft design, and the need to focus on core competencies of pilots. And because of that, I find it really interesting that the single biggest lasting legacy of this accident was the implementation in the United States of the 1500-hour rule. This rule, with a few exceptions, requires pilots to have a minimum of 1,500 hours of total time and an air transport pilot license before they're allowed to operate as a pilot in heavy commercial passenger transport. This might sound like a great way to ensure that the pilots are experienced before they're allowed to fly passengers, but in reality, it does very little to ensure the proper competence of those pilots. Remember, both of the pilots in this accident had more than 1,500 hours of total time, and the first officer had spent many years as an instructor getting exactly the kind of experience that most pilots in the US now must do in order to reach those 1,500 hours. In Europe, a cadet can be employed straight out of flight school with as little as 250 hours of total time, provided that they meet the strict competence requirements of the airline and that they're able to absorb the training so that they can pass the required skill tests. The 1,500-hour rule has, to my knowledge, not increased safety in any measurable form, but it has helped create a pilot shortage and a lot of financial stress for many new pilots in the United States. Now, check out this really interesting video next, or this playlist if you want to binge on more accident videos. Please consider subscribing to the channel if you like it, and join my Patreon crew if you want to support my work. Have an absolutely fantastic day, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.